Section 19 of A Daughter of the Sioux. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mike Vendetti, MikeVendetti.com. A Daughter of the Sioux by General Charles King. Chapter 19. A Slap for the Major. The columns of Colonel Henry and Major Webb, as said the chief, had united, and here were two men who could be counted on to push the pursuit for all they were worth. Hitherto, acting in open country and free from encumbrance, the Indians had been hard to reach. Now they were being driven into their fastness among the mountains towards the distant shelter whither their few wounded had been conveyed, and where the old men, the women, and children were hiding. Now it meant that unless the troops could be confronted and thrown back, another transfer of teepees and travois, ponies, and dogs, wounded and aged, would have to be made. Lame Wolf had thought his people safe behind the walls of the Big Horn and the shifting screen of warriors along the foothills, but the blue skirmish lines pushed steadily on into the fringing pines, driving the feathered braves from ridge to ridge, and Lame Wolf had sense enough to see that here were leaders that meant business and would not be held. Henry had 10 veteran troops at his back when he united with Webb, who led his own and Beecher's squadron, making 18 companies of troops of horse with their pack mules all out at the front, while the wagon train and ambulances were thoroughly guarded by a big battalion of sturdy infantry, nearly all of them good marksmen, against whose spiteful Springfields the warriors only made one essay in force, and that was more than enough. The bluecoats emptied many an Indian saddle and strewed the prairie with ponies, and sent Whistling Elk and his people to the right about in sore dismay. And then it dawned on Lame Wolf that he must now either mislead the cavalry leader, throw him off the track as it were, or move the villages, wounded prisoners and all, across the Big Horn River, where hereditary foemen, Shoshone and Absaraka, would surely welcome them red-handed. It was at this stage of the game he had his final split with Stabber. Stabber was shrewd, and saw unerringly that with the other columns out with Custer on the Little Horn and Washakie on the Wind River, with reinforcements coming from north and south, the surrounding of the Sioux in arms would be but a matter of time. He had done much to get Lame Wolf into this scrape, and now was urging hateful measures as, unless they were prepared for further and heavier losses, the one way out, and that way was surrender. Now this is almost the last thing the Indian will do, not from fear of consequences at the hands of his captors, for he well knows that physically he is infinitely better off when being coddled by Uncle Sam than when fighting in the field. It is simply the loss of prestige among his fellow redmen that he hates and dreads. Therefore, nothing short of starvation or probable annihilation prompts him, as a rule, to yield himself as a prisoner. Stabber urged it rather than risk further battle and further loss, but Stabber had long been jealous of the younger chief, envied him his much larger following, his record as a fighter, and Stabber presumably would be only too glad to see him fallen from his high estate. They could then enjoy the hospitality of a generous nation, a people of born fools, said the unreasoning and ungenerate red man, all winter, and when next they felt sufficiently slighted to warrant another issue on the warpath, they could take the field on equal terms. Lame Wolf therefore swore he'd fight to the bitter end. Stabber swore he'd gather all his villagers, now herding with those of Wolf, and, having segregated his sheep from the more numerous goats, would personally lead them whither the white man could not follow. At all events, he made this quarrel the pretext for his withdrawal from the full 50 fighting men, and Lame Wolf cursed him roundly as the wretch deserved, and all short-handed now, with hardly 500 braves to back him, bent his energy to checking Henry's column in the heart of the wild hill country. And this was the situation when the general's first dispatches were sent in to Frayne. This the last news to reach the garrison from the distant front for 5 long days. And then, one morning, when the snow was sifting softly down, There came tidings that thrilled the little community, heart and soul, tidings that were heard with mingled tears and prayers and rejoicings, and that led to many a visit of congratulation to Mrs. Hay, who, poor woman, dare not say at the moment that she had known it all as much as 24 hours earlier, despite the fact that Pete and Crapaud were banished from the roll of her auxiliaries. Even as the new couriers came speeding through the veil of falling flakes, riding jubilantly over the wide rolling prairie with their news of victory and battle, the post commander at Fort Frayne was puzzling over a missive that had come to him, he knew not how mysterious as the anarchist warnings said to find their way to the very bedside of the guarded Romanoffs. Sentry number 4 had picked it up on his post an hour before the dawn, a letter addressed in bold hand to Major Stanley Flint, commanding Fort Frayne, and presuming the major himself had dropped it, he turned it over to the corporal of his relief. And so it found its way towards Reveille, into the hands of old McGann, wheezing about his work of building fires, and Michael laid it on the major's table and thought no more about it, until 2 hours later, when the major roused and read, and then the row began that ended only with the other worries of his incumbency at Frayne. Secretly, Flint was still doing his best to discover the bearer when came the bold riders from the north with their thrilling news. Secretly, he had been over at the guardhouse, interviewing as best he could, by the aid of an unwilling clerk who spoke a little Sioux, a young Indian girl whom Crabb's convalescent squad, 4 in number, had most unexpectedly run down when sent scouting 5 miles up the Platte, and brought screaming, scratching, and protesting back to Frayne. Her pony had been killed in the dash to escape, and the 2 Indians with her seemed to be young lads not well schooled as warriors, for they rode away pell-mell over the prairie, leaving the girl to the mercy of the soldiers. Flint believed her to be connected in some way with the coming of the disturbing note, which was why he compelled her detention at the guardhouse. Under Webb's regime she would have been questioned by Hay or some one of his household. Under Flint, no one of Hay's family or retainers could be allowed to see her. He regarded it as most significant that her shrillest screams and fiercest resistance should have been reserved until just as her guardians were bearing her past the trader's house. She had a little light prison room to herself all that wintry morning, and there, disdainful of bunk or chair, enveloped in her blanket, she squatted disconsolate, greeting all questioners with defiant and fearless shruggings and inarticulate protest. Not a syllable of explanation, not a shred of news could their best endeavors wring from her. Yet her glittering eyes were surely in search of some one, for she looked up eagerly every time the door was opened, and Flint was just beginning to think he would have to send for Mrs. Hay when the couriers came with their stirring news, and he had to drop other affairs in order to forward this important matter to headquarters. Once again, it seems, Trooper Kennedy had been entrusted with distinguished duty, for it was he who came trotting foremost up the road, waving the dispatch on high. A comrade from Blake's troop, following through the ford, had turned to the left and led his horse up the steep to the quarters nearest the flagstaff. This time there was no big-hearted post commander to bid the Irishman refresh himself ad libitum. Flint was alone at his office at the moment, and knew not this strange trooper, and looked askance at his heterodox garb and war-worn guise. Such laxity, said he to himself, was not permitted where he had hitherto served, which was never on Indian campaign. Kennedy, having delivered his dispatches, stood mutely expectant of question, and struggling with an Irishman's enthusiastic eagerness to tell the details of heady flight. But Flint had but one method of getting at facts, the official reports, and Kennedy stood unnoticed until, impatient at last, he queried, "Beg pardon, sir, but may we put up our horses?" "Who's we?" asked the major bluntly. "And where are the others?" "Trigg, sir, Captain Blake's troop. He went to the captain's quarters with a package." "He should have reported himself to the post commander," said the major, who deemed it advisable to make prompt impression on these savage hunters of savage game. "Them wasn't his orders, sir," said Kennedy with zealous but misguided loyalty to his comrades and his regiment.